In the very familiar passage we just heard, the angel shouts, "Do not be afraid. I bring you good news." Well, ever since I was a kid, I've just received this at face value. But more recently, I find myself thinking, really? Because one of the biggest news stories of the past 8 years has been the fact that the news can't be trusted. Following Trump, people on the right derided the New York Times, CNN, and Washington Post as fake news, while those on the left said the same about Fox, Newsmax, and the New York Post. At first, I dismissed it as political posturing, but over time it's become clear that they're right. Whether you follow the Daily Wire or the Daily Beast, most of us have realized that even our preferred news outlet has a bias of some kind, an agenda. So certain facts are included or omitted. Certain stories are highlighted or ignored, depending on whether they align with the narrative being pushed. So they may not actually be lying, but they're using the truth selectively to distract us from the real story they don't want us to see. Actor Denzel Washington got it right years ago when he insisted that if you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. But if you do read the newspaper, you're misinformed. So when I hear any pundit or politician announce good news, I'm a lot more suspicious than I used to be. Can I really trust this? What are they not telling me? My kids have grown up in the world of filtered photos and false narratives, so they automatically assume they're not being told the whole truth. But for my generation, this has been a jarring discovery. We were taught to fully believe the institutions and authorities. If it was on the news, well, it must be true. If my parent or teacher said it, or especially if my preacher said it, I can trust it completely. They always know best, and they want the best for me. But the generation teaching us that knew it wasn't true. We were born just after Watergate and the Vietnam War, in which the government and media conspired to tell only the parts of the story that would ensure public support. They were reporting true stories, but not the real story, which was morally murkier than we were led to believe. People in power craft narratives that will keep them in power. They tell stories about how they're helping and protecting us that may be technically true, but are not the real story. And it's not just in the secular world. The year I became a Christian was also the year that both the Jim Bakker and Jimmy Swaggart scandals broke, exposing the shocking hypocrisy of America's most popular preachers. Most of what they said about Jesus was true, and they sure made it entertaining. But was it real? Were they ever truly encountering God's Spirit? Or was it all just a show? I never really cared about all that until it became personal. When I became a Christian during high school, I was still trying to figure Jesus out, but I had total faith in the charismatic pastor of the megachurch I'd started attending. He was as smart as any PhD, as smooth as any CEO, and wrote best-selling books, so even non-Christians admired and liked him. He was who I wanted to be. I wasn't sure yet what it meant to follow Jesus, so I followed that pastor, because those seemed like basically the same thing. The implied promise was that if I studied and lived and believed and stood strong like he did, I could have the kind of triumphant, impactful life that he did, which is why I was so devastated when it was revealed that he'd been hiding an extramarital affair with a subordinate and had misused power to silence any critics. I was so disoriented. His preaching about how to live in the transforming power and love of God had been so enthralling. But was any of it real? Have you ever wondered that about your faith? Is it just a bunch of cool ideas and cute stories? Or is this something that can actually matter when things hit the fan? In particular, I want to ask that question today about Christmas. It's enthralling, to be sure, and fun. But is it real? Does it actually matter when things go sideways? Or is it just great entertainment? Or great escape from reality? According to the book Generations by Strauss and Howe, people intuitively and perhaps unconsciously ask 4 key questions about any truth claim or ideology. But each generation has a gateway question, the one that needs to be answered first before the others even matter. Those 4 questions are: is it true? Is it real? Is it good? Is it beautiful? So as we approach Christmas this year, we're asking all 4 of those questions about Christmas. Last week, Pastor John talked about whether it's true, but today I'd like to explore whether it's real. Does this story of God visiting the earth 2,000 years ago actually affect my life today? We sing songs and we decorate like it's a big deal, but does it actually make any difference in my real life? Like when I'm having an argument with a family member or struggling to pay the bills, which only get bigger around Christmas time, even if the story's historically true, is it real? And you may be wondering, what's the difference between those? I mean, can it be real if it isn't true? Or true if it isn't real? It's confusing at first, but we all understand this distinction when we hear about Aesop's fables. Are they true? I mean, did a turtle actually outrun a rabbit in some kind of jungle jog for joy? Of course not. But does slow and steady sometimes win in real life? Absolutely. Aesop's fables aren't historically true, but they're real. And growing up, I didn't think that Christmas was either one. Santa on his magic sleigh seems about as silly to me as the nativity scenes we often see. First of all, supposedly newborn Jesus often looks bigger than a toddler. No way Mary would be smiling after giving birth to that. Speaking of smiling, I've had enough kids to know that infants don't smile. Unless maybe they're passing gas. So is that what we're seeing in these manger scenes? And if so, why is everybody else smiling? Gross! Oh, and the impeccably groomed cows, ponies, and baby sheep all admiring docile baby Jesus. It's ridiculous. This isn't real. And maybe that's the point. Maybe we concoct Christmas fairy tales about flying reindeer and babies in barns to escape from reality. And honestly, maybe inventing ways to escape isn't such a bad idea. Right at the time of year when depression rates skyrocket due to disappearing daylight, and we're still recovering from Thanksgiving with extended family, we haven't yet acclimated to the winter weather, and we're spending more money than we have to buy gifts for people who don't need them. Maybe it makes sense that we console ourselves by consuming way too many carbs and distract ourselves from harsh reality with cute stories about glowing noses, magical stars, and distant kings. We imagine Santa's village in the North Pole where there's no poverty, injustice, or war, no inflation, racism, depression, or divorce. It's the wonderful world we all long to live in, rather than the one we do live in. And don't give another thought to the child labor in China required to produce our Christmas gifts, because they were made by cute little elves who sing cheerfully as they work. Drown your worries about your credit card bill with hot cocoa and candy canes. It's all kind of fun, but a lot of us suspect that this is fake news. Maybe Buddy was right, that the purveyors of Christmas sit on a throne of lies. I'm being flippant, but I suspect that this is what the shepherds we read about must have thought that first Christmas. Because this story can't be real. It doesn't make any sense. Yes, they'd heard all their lives about a Messiah coming to save them, but, religion, opiate of the masses, and all that. Keeping oppressed people waiting with promises of something better can keep them quiet in the meantime. But despite all the goofy pictures we see, these were not some naive simpletons who would have been easily deceived. I'm a city kid, so my understanding of shepherds is mostly formed from storybooks. So I imagine the shepherds to be jolly, salt-of-the-earth types, trustworthy people with big smiles and little stress. But that's more fake news. Because in ancient Israel, shepherds were considered lowlifes and criminals. They were maligned and mistreated like the gypsies of Europe or carnival workers. On top of all these suspicions, their dirty work disqualified them from even entering the temple, which is ironic when you realize that while most shepherds owned their own flocks, these shepherds couldn't even afford that. So they were hired hands caring for the sheep that didn't belong to them. And Bethlehem was where the sheep for the temple sacrifices were kept. So the sheep were welcome in the temple, but not the shepherds who cared for them, implying that religious people, and maybe even God, regarded them as less than animals. And as if that's not enough, these shepherds were truly the lowest of the low. Long before cell phones and flashlights, these are the graveyard shift shepherds who stay out all night while decent people sleep to protect the flocks from wolves and bears, sometimes at the cost of their own lives. But no matter. They're shepherds. They're expendable. They don't matter very much. Are you getting the picture? Shepherds are despised, and their dirty lives are saturated with danger. Even God doesn't care about them. Many of these guys had that job because they were on the run from regular society. They weren't welcome among civilized folks. Many of them had a past. Many of them had a secret. Many of them had a reason to be hiding in the dark when suddenly, out of nowhere, an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. We think of Christmas Eve as a sweet time, silent night. But at least for the shepherds, it was terrifying. Why were they terrified? Because God doesn't like people like them. And when you have a secret to keep, when you're hiding in the dark for a reason, God suddenly showing up probably isn't good news. You know what I mean if you've ever been pulled over by the police. The second you see those blue lights, you are filled with fear. Did I come to a full stop? Did I remember a signal? Is my inspection up to date? What about the sticker on my license plate? Is my seatbelt on? Am I speeding? What is the speed limit here anyway? You know you're in trouble for something. That's probably what the shepherds were feeling that night. They were excluded and despised. They were hiding in the darkness, hoping not to get caught, when suddenly God showed up, probably to punish them. So of course they were terrified. But the angel declared, "Do not be afraid. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people." Good news? Yeah, well, when the cops pull you over, it's never good news. Hey, you're such a great driver. I just had to meet you and shake your hand. That never happens. When you get called to the boss's office or the vice principal's office, you never think, "Ooh, good news. The vice principal wants to see me." But the angel assured, "Do not be afraid. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people." And I can only guess that the shepherds thought, yeah, that can't be real. Even if God did have good news, it wouldn't be for us. It could be good for the priests, maybe, or for the good people who live in the suburbs with their 2.5 kids, do everything right, obey all the rules. Yeah, God might have some good news for them. But for us, no. And now, no way. During the glorious reign of King David, when Israel was faithful and flourishing, maybe. But now, in the middle of the night, in the middle of decades of foreign occupation, you think that God's going to show up and give us great joy? Yeah, that's fake news for sure. Even God doesn't want to be here. And besides, this story makes no sense. God finally arrived to rescue us from the Romans, but showed up as a baby? Yeah, I don't buy it. So I wonder if I've been reading verse 15 wrong for all these years. I'd always imagined a childlike fascination. Let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that's happened, which the Lord has told us about. But maybe it was more cynical. I'd like to see this. And I first started wondering this after sharing this story with my kids. Many of you know that my wife and I have adopted 11 kids, 3 of whom arrived as teenagers after surviving for 9 years as orphans in a refugee camp in Uganda. They knew what it's like to be poor, to be discarded, to sleep in the pitch black darkness outside with cattle or inside with chickens and goats. So they knew so many things I didn't, but they didn't know the details of the Christmas story. So that first Advent together, we read the classic passages from the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, one verse at a time, so that we could discuss each detail. Some of you have heard this story because it impacted me so greatly. But when we got to the part about Jesus being born among animals and laid in a feeding trough, they pulled back skeptically and started debating intensely in their own language. After a moment, the oldest asked me to clarify, "You mean where the animals eat?" "Yeah." More contentious chatter. After a little more squabbling, the oldest crossed his arms defiantly and said, "No, that didn't happen. God would never do that. It's disgusting." He was angry that I would invent something so offensive and obviously untrue. And I realized in that moment that I'd been reading this story and probably a lot of Bible stories all wrong. I'd heard 1,000 explanations up to that point about how true and beautiful the Christmas story is. But until that night, I'd never realized how shockingly real it is. I'd always imagined the manger scene to be so sanitary and sweet, like I'd seen on 1,000 Christmas cards. But my kids had lived with animals not so long ago, so they knew the reality. God would never stoop that low. God would never go there. God was better than that. It made no sense. And I realized, for the very first time, that this was exactly the point Luke was making. He was shocked too. Writing from the vantage point decades later, after seeing many of Jesus' miracles, Luke didn't wonder about whether it was true, but he marveled at how real God got. And his original readers, whose lives were a lot more like those of my kids, must have been confounded as well. This is supposed to be a story about the God of all creation coming to save us, and he shows up as a human who could suffer and bleed and die, who'd get diseases and diarrhea, acne, and athlete's foot like the rest of us. Why would God do that? It's beneath him. And if that's not already unthinkable, God didn't come as a Caesar living in a palace somewhere. He came as a weak little baby born in a barn. Why would God do that? He should be hobnobbing with princes and priests, not living in poverty. He's supposed to overpower the Roman army, not live under their oppression. He was supposed to arrive as the King of Kings, surrounded by luxury and wrapped in glory, not surrounded by manure and wrapped in a diaper. It's disgusting. God would never do that. And that's what those shepherds thought too. God coming to criminals and lowlifes like us? We don't deserve that. God would never do that. Let's go see about this. So they hurried off and found Mary and Joseph and the baby who was lying in the manger. What the angels had said was true. They didn't expect that. But what they really didn't expect was how real it was. God was showing up. Where there was darkness and despair, God was coming to sinners and shepherds who'd been told all their lives that God despised them. But there God was, wrapped in a blanket, and sleeping in the hay. And while the priests were still snoozing, and before bringing the kings, God tells the shepherds this good news first of all, the people who'd always been last of all. And here's the reason all this matters for us. There's so much about this season that is deliberately and gloriously unreal. But no matter how much you may love all the parties and presents and Christmas trees and candy canes and Rudolph and Elf and Frosty, Jingle Bells, Mariah Carey and Santa Claus, none of those are what makes Christmas so special. Those can be fun, but they're not real, which makes them a weird way to celebrate Christmas, because that's the day that God got real in a way no one ever expected. God stepped down into every part of our reality. Yes, the laughter and the great joy, but also into the darkness, into the mess. God was showing us who he really is, who he always has been and always will be, the God who shows up in the darkness. The God who shows up in our darkness, in our mess. It's easy to believe that God's there when things are going wonderfully. You're healthy and happy, and your loved ones are as well. It's easy to believe that God's close when you're singing worship songs or watching a sunset over the ocean. I can hear God's delight in the laughter of my granddaughter. Those moments are real in the richest sense. We may still need to look for Jesus in those moments, but when we're surrounded by light, it's much easier to see him. But what about in the darkness? When you're awake in the middle of the night, worrying about your finances, your future, or a broken friendship, it can feel like God is a million miles away. That's the last place that God would want to be. Yeah, that's what the shepherds thought too. And they were just as wrong as we are. That's exactly where God shows up. Don't believe me? I get it. The shepherds didn't believe it either. And even after, angels announced it to them, but despite their doubts, at least they were willing to go look. Next time, when you're up in the middle of the night, anxious and alone, or swimming in shame, even if you doubt what I'm saying could be true, would you be willing to look? I've had a lot of nights like that. I used to resist and resent that I struggled to sleep, but I've discovered that contrary to what my emotions are telling me, God is there, inviting me to come hang out. So now I get up without complaint, confident that my Savior is waiting for me. I get a mug of warm milk, relax in a comfy chair, and listen to a playlist of worship music that helps me pray by reminding me of even more topics that God and I can talk about. Silent night. Holy night. Sleep isn't the only way to enjoy heavenly peace. Or how about when you're fighting with a family member or spouse? All you can see is anger and pain. That's the last place that God would want to be. But it's exactly where God is. Could you pause your accusing and defending just long enough to look? Jesus is there. So let him join the conversation and see if that doesn't change it. My experience is that while I've had several mountaintop encounters with Jesus, most of the times I've met him have been in the darkest valleys where I assumed that God would never go. My broken marriage, my broken back, by the bedside of a desperately sick child. Moments I felt hopeless and alone. But there God was, waiting for me to look, to walk with him, step by step in the darkness to the light on the other side. When the shepherds found that Jesus really was there on that dark night, in the last place they expected, they were filled with joy and returned to real life, glorifying and praising God for all the things that they'd heard and seen, which were just as they'd been told. Jesus can meet us in the darkness, but it won't leave us there. The reason that we gather every Sunday and in small groups is that while on any given week some of us are basking in light, others of us are lost in darkness. No matter which one you are that day, like the shepherds, we gather to look for Jesus together and discover that he's not just here in church. He's with us always, in every part of life. He sees us whether we see him or not. There's no place you can go that God isn't already there. So God isn't just good, beautiful, or true, though he's all those. God is real. He showed us that by coming as Jesus, born in poverty, born in captivity, born in a barn. It's ironic that we celebrate Christmas by creating escapist fantasies when Jesus celebrated Christmas by embracing the hardest parts of reality. I know it makes some people uncomfortable, but this is why we confess in our sermons some of the questions we have, the mistakes we've made, and the sins we're still struggling with. Unlike my pastor all those years ago, I don't want to pretend to be some kind of perfect person who no longer needs forgiveness or help. I need both every day. I need a Savior who's willing to embrace sinners, because that's what I am. And that's what you are. Friends, enjoy the holiday revelry. But know this, the fairy tales we tell at Christmas won't help you when life gets real, when life gets hard, when even the days feel dark. In those moments, we don't need an escape. We need an encounter with God, the God who cares about shepherds and came as a baby. And that's why we celebrate Christmas. So, Merry Christmas, my friends.